Each year, the United States military spends billions of dollars maintaining security at installations that officially don't exist. Facilities buried so deep underground that their construction required engineering capabilities that push the absolute limits of what's technologically possible. And yet these massive subterranean complexes somehow remain completely absent from congressional budgets, oversight committees, and even the classified inventories that presidents are supposedly briefed on when they take office. The Jicarilla Apache Reservation in northwestern New Mexico spans over 800,000 acres of high desert terrain, a landscape of mesas and canyons and underground cave systems that have existed for millions of years. And beneath this sovereign tribal land, according to persistent rumors that first surfaced in the early 1980s, lies a facility so secret that even confirming its existence would require security clearances that fewer than 100 people in the entire world possess. Between 1976 and 1982, during the height of Cold War tensions, when the United States and Soviet Union were locked in competition over everything from nuclear weapons to exotic propulsion systems, construction crews and military personnel were allegedly shuttled to a remote location near the town of Dulce, population barely 2,600, where they excavated 7 levels of underground facilities extending nearly half a mile into the earth. Though officially no such construction ever occurred, and the geological surveys of the area show nothing but natural cave formations and abandoned mining tunnels from the early 1900s. For a brief period during March and April of 1981 excavation, team working on what internal documents referred to only as Level 7 expansion broke through into a natural cavern system that shouldn't have existed according to all previous geological mapping. And what they found in those ancient chambers would force an immediate halt to all construction, result in the complete abandonment of multiple subterranean levels that had cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build, and lead to the systematic elimination of everyone who'd been present when the discovery was made. Their deaths staged as accidents and illnesses, and suicides spread across months and years to avoid pattern recognition. But what exactly was waiting in those caves beneath the New Mexico desert that had been sealed away from the surface world for millennia? And why do the Jicarilla Apache elders, when pressed by researchers willing to listen, quietly insist that their ancestors knew something was down there that their oral traditions explicitly warned against, disturbing the deep places, and that the military's arrival and subsequent panic departure proved that some warnings exist for reasons that transcend superstition and touch on truths that modern rationality is fundamentally unprepared to accept? The Dulce area occupies a remote section of the Jicarilla Apache Reservation in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, approximately 7,000 feet above sea level, where the landscape is dominated by Arcolita Mesa, a massive geological formation that rises abruptly from the surrounding terrain and contains extensive cave systems that have never been fully mapped or explored. The region experiences extreme temperature variations, from scorching summer days exceeding 95 degrees to winter nights that plummet well below freezing. And the geological composition includes unusual concentrations of volcanic rock limestone caves and mineral deposits that create natural electromagnetic anomalies capable of disrupting compass readings and radio communications. The town of Dulce itself, with a population that has never exceeded 3,000 residents, primarily from the Jicarilla Apache Nation, sits in a valley surrounded by mesas and canyons that provide natural concealment from aerial observation. And the area's remoteness, combined with its status as sovereign tribal land requiring special permissions for outside access, has made it an ideal location for activities that require absolute isolation from civilian oversight. It is perhaps unsurprising then that when classified military projects required locations for deep underground construction during the Cold War era, this remote corner of New Mexico, with its existing cave systems and legal barriers to uninvited investigation, became the site of excavations that would eventually extend deeper into the earth than any officially acknowledged facility in North America. The Jicarilla Apache oral traditions, maintained across generations through carefully preserved stories told by tribal elders, include specific warnings about Arcoleta Mesa and the cave systems within it, describing the deep places as where the ant people live, beings that existed underground long before humans walked the surface and who occasionally emerged during ancient times to interact with the ancestors, teaching them survival techniques, but also demonstrating powers that made it clear they were not human, despite their superficially humanoid appearance. Spanish conquistadors who explored the region in the 1600s documented in mission records that the local indigenous people absolutely refused to enter certain caves, claiming that those who go too deep do not return the same, and that sounds could sometimes be heard emanating from underground rhythmic patterns that resembled speech, but in no language the Apache recognized. In 1947, the same year as the famous Roswell incident, just 150 miles to the southeast, ranchers near Dulce reported finding cattle mutilated in ways that veterinarians couldn't explain, with organs removed through incisions so precise they appeared surgical, and with the animals' bodies completely drained of blood through methods that left no trace on the surrounding ground, a pattern of cattle mutilations that would continue in the area for decades and become one of the most documented unsolved mysteries in New Mexico history, with over 1,000 cases reported between 1967 and 1982 alone. Construction on what would become the Dulce facility allegedly began in 1976 when geological survey teams, operating under Department of Energy contracts that officially related to geothermal research, began extensive mapping of the cave systems beneath Arcoleta Mesa and determined that the natural formations could be expanded and reinforced to create a secure underground installation. Between 1976 and 1979, construction crews from multiple contractors, each working on isolated sections without knowledge of the overall project scope, excavated and built 7 distinct levels extending progressively deeper into the earth, with the upper levels devoted to conventional purposes like storage and communications, while the deeper levels, particularly 6 and 7, were designated for research purposes that remained classified even from most of the construction personnel. By early 1980, the facility was operational, with a permanent staff estimated at between 200 and 400. Personnel, including military civilian scientists and security contractors, though no official budget line or personnel roster for such a facility has ever been acknowledged to exist. On March 7, 1980, an excavation team led by Army Corps of Engineers personnel was tasked with expanding Level 7 to create additional laboratory space when their drilling equipment broke through into a natural cavern that geological surveys had somehow completely missed. A massive chamber that extended far beyond the reach of their lighting equipment and which contained architectural features that were definitely not natural formations. Structures that appeared to have been deliberately constructed using methods and materials that didn't match any known human engineering from any historical period. March 7, 1980, 14:20 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Frost Mackenzie, a 38-year-old civil engineer with the Army Corps of Engineers who'd overseen the construction of 3 previous underground facilities, including the Cheyenne Mountain Complex in Colorado, was supervising the Level 7 expansion when her drilling team, consisting of 6 experienced excavation specialists and 2 geologists, breached what they'd assumed was a standard limestone wall and instead found themselves staring into a void so vast that their high-powered work lights couldn't illuminate the far walls. The temperature in the excavation tunnel had been a steady 62 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained by the facility's climate control systems, but the moment the breach opened, everyone present felt a rush of air from the cavern beyond that was significantly colder, perhaps 40 degrees, and carried a smell that geologist Dr. Patricia Vance described in her initial report as mineral-rich but also organic, like being in a cave system that contains both ancient rock and something that was once alive but has been dead for a very long time. Frost ordered the excavation team to hold position while she personally entered the breach with Dr. Vance and Master Sergeant William Torres, the facility's head of security, each equipped with portable lighting communications gear and sidearms that Frost hoped wouldn't be necessary, but had learned through 2 decades of FOD military service to never enter unknown spaces without. The cavern beyond the breach was not a natural formation in any conventional sense. Its dimensions were too regular, its walls too smooth, and within 20 feet of entering they encountered the first structural wall that rose from the cavern floor and curved away into darkness. Constructed from a material that resembled obsidian or volcanic glass, but which, when Frost touched, it was neither cold nor warm, but rather seemed to be at exactly the same temperature as her hand, as if it was somehow neutralizing thermal transfer. The wall's surface was covered in symbols, not carved into the material, but rather appearing to be part of its structure, geometric patterns that repeated in ways that suggested language or mathematical notation. And Dr. Vance was photographing these symbols when Sergeant Torres quietly pointed out that the wall extended upward far beyond what their lights could reach, and that the curvature suggested they weren't looking at a wall, but rather the exterior of a massive cylindrical structure, something like a tower but inverted, extending downward into depths that their preliminary measurements indicated shouldn't exist because they were already nearly half a mile below the surface, and geological surveys showed solid bedrock continuing for at least another 1,000 feet. At 14:47 hours, 27 minutes after the initial breach, the excavation team's radio operator reported that all communications with the upper levels had ceased functioning, not from interference or equipment failure, but rather the radios simply transmitted static despite showing normal operational status. And when Frost ordered everyone to return to the breach point, they discovered something that made her blood run cold. The opening they'd entered through was no longer visible. The tunnel they'd just walked through seemed to extend in a different direction than they'd come from, and compass readings were spinning randomly rather than pointing north, as if magnetic north had ceased to exist, or as if they'd somehow moved to a location where Earth's magnetic field didn't penetrate. Frost made the decision to follow the obsidian wall, reasoning that any constructed structure must have an entrance or opening, and as the team moved along its perimeter, they began noticing additional details that transformed confusion into genuine fear. The symbols on the wall's surface were subtly changing, not dramatically, but enough that Dr. Vance, who'd been photographing them methodically, realized that patterns she'd documented 15 minutes earlier now showed different configurations when she looked back at the wall, as if the symbols were rearranging themselves, or as if the wall was displaying different information, depending on who was observing it or when it was being observed. The air in the cavern had a quality that Frost's engineering background struggled to categorize, a thickness that wasn't humidity or pressure, but rather felt like the space itself was more dense, as if moving through it required fractionally more effort than normal. And several team members reported experiencing mild vertigo and a persistent sensation that the floor beneath them was not quite level, even though spirit levels showed perfectly flat surfaces. At 15:12 hours, 45 minutes after losing communications, the team encountered the first opening in the obsidian structure, a doorway approximately 7 feet tall and 4 feet wide, with edges so precisely defined they appeared to have been cut with laser precision. And beyond that doorway was a corridor that extended into darkness, its walls made of the same material and covered in the same shifting symbols. Frost was preparing to enter when one of the excavation specialists, a civilian contractor named Robert Huang, who'd worked underground construction for 15 years, suddenly grabbed her arm and said, "We need to leave. Right now, something is very wrong with this place." And when she asked him to specify what he meant, he pointed at their shadows on the cavern floor, and everyone simultaneously realized that the shadows weren't quite matching their movements. lagging behind by perhaps half a second. And more disturbingly, the shadows sometimes moved in ways that didn't correspond to any motion the team members were making, as if they were developing a degree of independence. Dr. Vance was using her camera to document the doorway when the device's screen began displaying impossible images views of the cavern from angles that her camera wasn't positioned to capture, showing the team from above and behind, and somehow from inside simultaneously. And then the screen went completely black except for a series of symbols that matched the patterns on the obsidian walls, symbols that seemed to pulse in rhythm with something, and when Frost asked what the rhythm was, Sergeant Torres quietly replied, "It matches my heartbeat, exactly, and that should not be possible." The temperature had dropped further, now registering at 35 degrees. Despite no apparent source of cold and frost, was forming on equipment and on the exposed skin of team members. Crystalline patterns that weren't random, but rather followed geometric designs fractals that repeated at every scale and seemed to encode some form of information that human eyes could perceive, but human minds couldn't quite process. At 15:34 hours, Frost made the command decision that exploration should cease and evacuation should begin immediately. But when she ordered the team to retrace their path to the breach point, they discovered that the cavern had somehow reconfigured itself, or rather their perception of it had been altered in ways that made navigation impossible because corridors that they'd walked through now led to different locations, and the obsidian structure that had been on their right was now on their left, despite none of them remembering turning around. It was during this increasingly desperate attempt to find the exit that civilian contractor Robert Huang walked through what appeared to be an opening in the cavern wall and simply vanished, not through distance, but through impossible instantaneous absence. One moment he was visible to everyone, the next moment he was gone, and the opening he'd walked through sealed itself, or perhaps had never existed at all, leaving only smooth stone, where team members were certain they'd just seen a passage. The remaining 8 personnel began experiencing synchronized symptoms, nosebleeds that started simultaneously a high-pitched tone that everyone could hear, but which their audio equipment didn't register, and a growing certainty that they were being observed by something vast and patient that existed just beyond their perceptual framework, watching them the way humans might watch insects in a controlled environment, with curiosity but without any particular concern for their well-being. Dr. Vance collapsed at 15:47 hours, her vital signs stable, but her consciousness apparently gone, and when medic Corporal Jennifer Hayes attempted to revive her, Vance's eyes opened to reveal pupils that had dilated to the point where almost no iris remained visible, and she spoke in a voice that was layered, multiple tones occupying the same space, saying in English that was too precise, too grammatically perfect to be natural speech. "They are not hostile. They are resident. You are the ones who entered their space. They have been here for duration that predates your species' existence. They permitted your upper constructions because those did not penetrate to critical depth. Level 7 has crossed boundary. You are now in their architecture, and they require assessment before determining appropriate response to your intrusion." Frost was attempting to process this information and request immediate backup from upper levels when the obsidian structure, that massive cylindrical tower or inverted building, began to emit light, not from any visible source, but rather the material itself started glowing with a pale luminescence that hurt to look at directly. And in that light, the team could finally see the full scope of what they'd discovered. The cavern was not a natural formation, but rather an immense chamber that had been deliberately excavated, or perhaps had existed before the surrounding geology formed, and it contained not just one obsidian structure, but dozens of them, towers and walls and geometric forms that followed architectural principles that human engineering had never conceived of, structures that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions, because looking at them from different angles revealed features that couldn't coexist in normal space. At 15:56 hours an hour and 36 minutes after the initial breach, 3 entities appeared, not emerging from anywhere, but rather suddenly becoming visible as if they'd been present all along, but had chosen that moment to allow themselves to be perceived. And they were humanoid in the way that a child's stick figure drawing is humanoid, possessing bilateral symmetry and upright posture, but wrong in every detail, their proportions subtly off, their movements too smooth and too precise, and their skin, if it was skin, appeared translucent, showing internal structures that might have been organs or might have been something else entirely. Systems that pulsed with light and seemed to serve functions that biology as humans understood it didn't require. Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie's military training demanded that she attempt to establish communication protocols with any intelligence encountered, hostile or otherwise, and so despite every instinct screaming at her to run, she raised her empty hands in what she hoped was a universal gesture of non-aggression and spoke clearly in English, identifying herself by rank and name and stating that the intrusion was unintentional, that the excavation team had no knowledge that the cavern system was occupied, and that they would withdraw immediately if permitted to do so. The three entities, standing approximately 15 feet away in a triangular formation, did not respond in any conventional sense, but Frost felt rather than heard something that might have been communication, a pressure in her mind that resolved into concepts rather than words, impressions of vast age, of this place existing long before human civilization, of the surface world being watched and catalogued and generally ignored because surface-dwelling species were transient, while those who built in the deep places planned in scales of geological time. Dr. Vance, still conscious, but clearly not entirely herself, began translating these impressions into spoken language, her voice maintaining that layered quality as she explained that the entities had permitted the construction of levels 1 through 6 because those depths fell within acceptable ranges, but level 7 had crossed into architecture that they considered their domain. And while they were not immediately hostile, they required assessment of human intentions and capabilities before determining whether coexistence was possible, or whether the surface constructions would need to be collapsed to prevent further intrusion. Sergeant Torres was attempting to maintain security protocols, his sidearm drawn but pointed at the ground, while the remaining team members were experiencing various levels of psychological stress, with 2 of the excavation specialists showing signs of dissociation and corporal haze, reporting that her medical equipment was malfunctioning, displaying readings that couldn't be accurate because they showed human biological signatures, but with configurations that didn't match known anatomy, as if the entities were scanning them and the equipment was picking up both human physiology and whatever biological framework the entities themselves possessed. At 16:23 hours, nearly 2 hours after the initial breach, Frost made the tactical decision to request that one member of the team be permitted to return to the upper levels to report the situation and arrange for appropriate diplomatic or scientific personnel to establish formal contact. And after a moment of that pressure communication, the entities appeared to consent. The cavern's geometry shifted in a way that made Frost's eyes water, and suddenly the breach opening was visible again, exactly where it had originally been, as if the confusing navigation of the previous hour had been some form of test or demonstration of the entity's control over their environment. She designated Sergeant Torres to make the return journey, gave him explicit instructions to report directly to the facility commander, and to emphasize that this was a first contact situation requiring extreme caution rather than a security threat requiring military response. And as Torres moved toward the breach, one of the entities, the one positioned at the apex of their triangle formation, turned its head to track his movement with a fluidity that was deeply unsettling because the motion was too smooth, lacking the small corrections and adjustments that biological creatures make when shifting attention. And Frost understood that they were allowing Torres to leave, that they could have prevented his exit as easily as they'd confused the team's navigation earlier, and that everything happening was occurring within parameters that the entities were controlling, with casual ease that suggested capabilities far beyond what human technology could currently achieve or counter. Sergeant Torres reached the upper levels at 16:37 hours and immediately reported to Colonel Raymond Ashcroft, the facility's commanding officer, a career intelligence officer who'd been read into enough classified programs to know that official protocol often mattered less than practical reality when dealing with situations that fell outside conventional military planning. Ashcroft initiated emergency protocols, locking down all 7 levels, evacuating non-essential personnel to the surface, and convening what classified documentation would later refer to as the crisis assessment team, a group that included military intelligence, civilian scientific advisors, and remarkably, 2 representatives from the Jicarilla Apache Tribal Council, who were brought in under emergency consultation agreements that had been established when the facility was first constructed, agreements that officially didn't exist, but which both the military and the tribe maintained, because there were some forms of knowledge that transcended security clearances and required indigenous expertise. Elder Joseph Whitehorse, an 82-year-old keeper of traditional stories, listened to Sergeant Torres's description of the entities and the obsidian structures, and then spoke for 20 minutes without interruption, explaining through a translator, because he insisted on using the traditional language for concepts that English couldn't adequately convey, that the Apache had always known something was beneath Arcolita Mesa, that their oral traditions called them the Ants People, not because they resembled ants, but because they lived in vast underground colonies and demonstrated collective intelligence that suggested they thought as a unified organism, rather than as individuals, that during ancient times these beings had occasionally emerged during periods of great drought or disaster to provide assistance to the Apache ancestors, teaching preservation techniques and survival strategies, but always returning to the deep places and never attempting to live on the surface, because, in Whitehorse's words, they see time differently than we do. For them, the surface is a place that changes too quickly, too chaotically. They build for permanence in ways that surface life cannot understand. Colonel Ashcroft then authorized access to classified archives that even most of the facility's personnel didn't know existed. Files that documented the site's selection process and revealed that the Dulce location had been chosen specifically because preliminary geological surveys in 1973 had detected anomalies that suggested artificial structures at significant depth, that rather than avoiding these anomalies, the facility had been deliberately positioned to investigate them, and that the entire construction project had been, from its inception, designed to make contact with whatever had created the deep architecture, though official documentation carefully avoided stating this objective explicitly in case the project was ever subject to oversight or investigation. The files included translations of Spanish missionary records from the 1600s, references to Apache legends that matched Elder Whitehorse's account, and disturbingly, a 1947 memorandum from the Roswell Army Airfield, suggesting that materials recovered from the famous crash site showed construction techniques that resembled architectural principles observed in ancient structures throughout the American Southwest, with a notation that further investigation of indigenous traditional knowledge regarding subterranean civilizations is warranted and may provide context for understanding non-terrestrial engineering. By 1710 hours, 3 hours after the initial breach, Colonel Ashcroft had made the decision to establish a formal negotiation framework, selecting a team of 3 personnel to return to Level 7. Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie, who was already present, and had established initial contact Dr. Eugene Ramirez, a linguist and anthropologist with expertise in nonverbal communication systems, and Captain Lisa Thor, a psychologist specializing in first contact protocols who'd been consulting on classified programs exploring potential interactions with non-human intelligence. And this team was briefed on their primary objective, which was simple: determine whether coexistence was possible, and if so, establish parameters that would allow the facility to continue operating without further intrusion into the entity's territory, and if coexistence was not possible, assess whether evacuation of the facility could be accomplished safely or whether the entities posed an active threat that would require more aggressive response options that nobody wanted to consider, but which contingency planning demanded remain available. The negotiation team descended to level 7 at 17:45 hours, accompanied by Sergeant Torres, who would serve as security, and by Elder Whitehorse, who had insisted on being present despite his age, stating that if they have been here as long as our stories say, they may remember my ancestors and respond to traditional protocols of respect that military procedure doesn't include. The breach remained open, and the journey through the cavern to the location where Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie and her team waited was navigable now, as if the entities had chosen to make the path clear. And upon arrival, they found Mackenzie's team physically intact, but psychologically stressed in ways that 3 hours of proximity to the entities and their architecture had inevitably produced, with Dr. Vance still conscious, but still speaking occasionally in that layered voice, translating impressions that she claimed came from the entities, though she couldn't explain how she was receiving them. Dr. Ramirez attempted to establish structured communication using a combination of mathematical symbols, visual patterns, and carefully structured English, while also incorporating gestures that anthropological research suggested might have cross-cultural meaning. And after approximately 20 minutes of these attempts, the entities responded not with their own communication, but by altering Dr. Vance's translations to become more specific and structured, as if they were learning to use her as a clearer interface than the vague impressions they transmitted initially. What emerged over the next 2 hours of careful exchange was a narrative that fundamentally challenged assumptions about who had built what beneath New Mexico. The entities explained through Vance's increasingly fluent translations that they had not constructed the deep architecture, but had rather discovered it, that they too were explorers, or perhaps refugees from somewhere else, and that they had found these caverns and structures approximately 15,000 years ago by human calendar, and had claimed them as habitat because their species required deep, stable environments with specific mineral compositions and electromagnetic properties that surface environments lacked. The obsidian structures were not theirs, but rather had been here when they arrived, constructed by something even older that was no longer present, or perhaps had never been biological in any sense that either humans or these entities understood, and the structures demonstrated properties that both species found useful but neither fully comprehended. The symbols on the walls were information storage, or perhaps something more fundamental, encoding not just data, but physical laws and dimensional frameworks. And neither the entities nor humans possessed the context to fully decode them, though both could interact with them in limited ways. Elder Whitehorse, who had been observing silently, then spoke directly to the entities through Dr. Vance, using formal Apache protocols for addressing ancient powers, and something shifted in the quality of the communication, the entity's attention focusing more intently, and through Vance they acknowledged that yes, they had encountered humans before, specifically the ancestors of the Apache and other tribes of the region, that they had provided limited assistance during times of environmental crisis, because they understood what it meant to be a species struggling to survive in a challenging environment, but that they had always maintained distance, because close contact between species with vastly different temporal perception and social organization tended to end badly for whichever species was less technologically developed. At 2015 hours, 4.5 hours after the initial breach, the communication reached a critical point when Captain Thorne asked directly whether the entities would permit the Dulce facility to continue operating if humans agreed to limit excavation to the upper 6 levels and to never again breach into level 7 or below. And the entities, through Dr. Vance, responded with a question rather than an answer. They asked what humans intended to do with the facility, what research was being conducted, and most specifically, whether humans were attempting to develop weapons or technologies that would allow them to detect or intrude upon other deep-dwelling species elsewhere on the planet or beyond it. The question revealed an anxiety that hadn't been apparent before, a concern that suggested the entities weren't just protecting their immediate territory, but were part of something larger, perhaps a network of subterranean civilizations that existed beneath multiple continents, maintaining their own society completely separate from surface life, and that they feared humans developing capabilities that would allow wholesale intrusion into deep places that these species had occupied for millennia, while surface civilizations rose and fell without ever knowing what existed beneath their feet. Before Colonel Ashcroft could formulate a response that was both honest and diplomatic, the situation deteriorated catastrophically when civilian contractor Robert Huang, who had vanished earlier through the Phantom opening, suddenly reappeared, walking out of solid obsidian wall as if it were liquid, but he was changed. His eyes now showing the same dilated pupils as Dr. Vance, his movements demonstrating that too smooth precision that suggested he wasn't entirely under his own control anymore. And when Captain Thorne asked if he was all right, he smiled with an expression that didn't reach his eyes and said in that terrible layered voice, "I volunteered to be bridge. They showed me what they needed us to understand. They showed me the architecture goes down 17 more levels. They showed me what's at the bottom. And they showed me what will wake up if humans keep drilling, keep excavating, keep pushing into depths that weren't meant for species that measure time in decades rather than epochs." And then he collapsed, vital signs failing rapidly despite Corporal Hayes' immediate intervention. And his final words before losing consciousness permanently were, "Don't go deeper. For the love of God, whatever you do, don't excavate level 8. At 20:47 hours, 32 minutes after Robert Huang collapsed with his cryptic warning about not excavating, level 8, the obsidian structures throughout the cavern began emitting that pale luminescence again, but far more intensely bright enough that personnel had to shield their eyes, and the three entities that had been maintaining their triangular formation suddenly multiplied 7 additional forms, materializing from nowhere, or perhaps simply choosing to become visible, demonstrating that what the team had been negotiating with was merely a small delegation of a much larger presence. The temperature dropped precipitously, frost forming on every surface including human skin, and the symbols on the obsidian walls began changing rapidly, cycling through configurations so quickly that they appeared to blur, and Dr. Vance, still serving as involuntary translator, began speaking in rapid bursts that suggested the entities were communicating amongst themselves rather than with the humans, discussing in their layered multi-tonal language whether the breach constituted sufficient threat to warrant more aggressive defensive measures. Elder Whitehorse stepped forward despite Captain Thorne's attempt to restrain him, and he spoke in Apache directly to the entities, his voice carrying an authority that transcended language barriers. And whatever he said caused a visible pause in the entities' agitation, their luminescence dimming slightly, though Dr. Vance translated his words as essentially a plea for patience, an invocation of the ancient assistance the entities had provided to his ancestors, and a promise that humans would honor boundaries if given the opportunity to withdraw peacefully and seal the breach permanently. The psychological strain on the human personnel present had been building incrementally over the 5 hours since initial contact, but at 2,103 hours, it reached critical mass when 2 of the excavation specialists, both experienced contractors who'd worked underground for decades, simultaneously began screaming that the cavern was shrinking, that the walls were closing in, though measurements showed no physical change in dimensions, suggesting the effect was perceptual, or perhaps that the entities were demonstrating their ability to manipulate human sensory interpretation of space. Corporal Hayes was attempting to sedate both men when she noticed that her own shadow on the cavern floor had separated entirely from her body and was moving independently, approaching one of the entities as if drawn to it. And when she tried to step away, her shadow remained in place, creating a disturbing disconnect between her physical position and where the darkness suggested she should be. Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie was maintaining command authority through sheer force of will, but even she reported in later debriefings that she could feel her sense of individual identity beginning to dissolve, that she was experiencing thoughts and memories that weren't hers, that she was perceiving the cavern from multiple positions, simultaneously, as if her consciousness was being distributed across several viewpoints, and that she understood this was the entities demonstrating how they experienced reality as a collective rather than as individuals, and that prolonged exposure might result in permanent alteration of human neural architecture. To match their collective framework, Dr. Ramirez had abandoned his linguistic analysis and was simply sitting on the cavern floor, drawing complex geometric shapes in the dust with his finger, shapes that he later couldn't remember drawing and couldn't explain when shown photographs. Mathematical expressions that professional mathematicians would later identify as relating to four-dimensional topology, but which Ramirez, whose expertise was anthropology and linguistics, had no training to produce. At 2,134 hours, the entities made a decision, and the nature of that decision became apparent when the obsidian structure, that massive inverted tower, began to open, not with doors or mechanical movement, but rather the material simply became permeable, transitioning from solid to something like thick liquid that flowed aside to reveal an interior space that shouldn't have been able to fit within the structures. External dimensions, a vast chamber that extended in directions that violated Euclidean geometry and contained row upon row of vertical cylinders that resembled nothing so much as stasis pods or preservation chambers, thousands of them, perhaps tens of thousands, receding into impossible distance. The entities, all 10 of them now visible, positioned themselves around the opening, and through Dr. Vance explained that this was their population, their civilization, existing in a state of reduced metabolic activity that allowed them to maintain presence across geological timescales, that the individuals who'd been interacting with the humans were merely caretakers, maintained minimal activity to monitor and maintain the chamber, and that the true population could be awakened if necessary, but that such awakening would require resources and space that would necessarily conflict with human surface activities, which is why they preferred to remain in this dormant state, observing and waiting until surface conditions became more suitable for their needs. Captain Thorne asked the obvious question. Waiting for what? And the answer that came through Dr. Vance was chilling in its implications. They were waiting for the next extinction event, the next great dying that periodically cleared the surface of dominant species and allowed new forms to emerge. They had witnessed such events multiple times during their occupancy of the deep places, and they would wait through however many more occurred until conditions aligned with their requirements for surface emergence and human civilization was simply the current temporary occupant of a planet that operated on cycles far longer than human historical memory could comprehend. The revelation that the entities viewed human civilization as a transient phase rather than as a permanent fixture created a moment of existential vertigo that affected every person, present the understanding that from the perspective of beings who measured time in epochs human history from the first civilizations to the present day was merely a brief moment barely worth noting, except as a potential disruption to their long-term plans. It was during this moment of stunned comprehension that the cavern began to shake, not with earthquake tremors, but with rhythmic vibrations that came from below, from deeper than level 7, and the entity's luminescence shifted from pale white to a warning red, and through Dr. Vance, they communicated with unmistakable urgency that the vibrations were exactly what Robert Huang had been warning about, that human excavation activities over the past 4 years had been detected by something that existed at depths far below even the entity's architecture, something that the entities themselves feared and avoided, something that they described only as the old mechanism that had been dormant for longer than their species had existed, but which human drilling and explosive excavation had begun to disturb. The obsidian structure sealed itself closed. The entities moved into a defensive formation that suggested whatever was coming from below was a threat to them as well as to humans. And at 2,156 hours, the cavern floor cracked. Not a natural geological fracture, but a perfectly straight line that extended for hundreds of feet. And from that crack emerged heat. Tremendous heat that raised the temperature from freezing to over 100 degrees in less than 30 seconds. And light, a deep red light that hurt to look at and seemed to carry information, or perhaps commands that human and entity nervous systems alike interpreted as overwhelming imperative to flee, to evacuate, to get as far from this location as possible before whatever was waking up completed its emergence from depths that no mapping had revealed and no excavation had intended to reach. At 2,159 hours, as the crack in the cavern floor widened and the red light intensified to levels that caused physical pain to anyone looking directly at it, the entities made a choice that likely saved every human life present. They used whatever technology or capability allowed them to manipulate spatial perception and created a direct corridor from the level 7 cavern to the facility's main elevator shaft, essentially folding space so that personnel could cover what should have been a quarter-mile journey through winding tunnels in less than 30 seconds of running. Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie didn't question the gift. She simply shouted orders for immediate evacuation, and her team, along with Dr. Ramirez, Captain Thorne, Elder Whitehorse, and the surviving excavation specialists, ran through a passage that hurt to perceive because it existed at angles that eyes weren't designed to process, and they emerged into the familiar industrial environment of the facility's upper levels, gasping and disoriented, but alive. Colonel Ashcroft had already initiated full evacuation protocols. Alarms were blaring throughout all 7 levels, and personnel were streaming toward the surface access points. And when Mackenzie reached the command center and reported that something was emerging from below, level 7, something that even the entities feared, Ashcroft made the command decision that would define the rest of his career. He ordered the facility abandoned and initiated self-destruct protocols that had been built into the deepest levels specifically for scenarios where containment could not be maintained. By 2234, hours 75 minutes after the cavern floor first cracked, all personnel had been evacuated to the surface and transported a minimum of 5 miles from Arcolita Mesa. And at 2,247 hours, a series of controlled explosions collapsed levels 6 and 7 entirely, followed by the ejection of nearly 200,000 tons of specialized concrete mixed with radar-absorbing materials and chemical sealants into the collapsed spaces, essentially entombing everything below. Level 5, under a plug of material designed to be permanent on geological timescales. The surface facility was dismantled over the following 6 weeks, every piece of equipment removed, every document shredded or classified beyond top secret into categories that effectively removed them from accessible record-keeping. Systems and the excavation sites were filled and landscaped to match the surrounding terrain. Dr. Vance and Robert Wong both survived but remained in military medical custody for the rest of their lives. Vance because she retained the ability to occasionally translate impressions from the entities, even at distance, suggesting her exposure had created a permanent connection. And Huang, because he had been shown things at depths humans weren't meant to witness, and his psychological profile indicated he posed a security risk if released into civilian life. The Jicarilla Apache Tribal Council was compensated through confidential agreements, and Elder Whitehorse, before his death in 1983, ensured that traditional warnings about Arcolita Mesa were reinforced in tribal education, though the specific details of what had occurred remained classified. The official record states that geological surveys conducted in the Dulce area between 1976 and 1980 determined that subsurface instability made the location unsuitable for the geothermal research facility that had been proposed, and that the project was abandoned at significant financial loss, but before any major construction had occurred, and no military installation ever existed beneath Arcolita Mesa, despite persistent rumors among conspiracy theorists, who point to the unusual number of security personnel who maintained presence in the area throughout the 1980s. Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie was promoted and transferred to a Pentagon administrative position, where she spent the remainder of her career managing classified facility construction projects, never returning to New Mexico. And in her retirement, she moved to Alaska, as far from deep desert caves as geography allowed. The entities beneath Archuleta Mesa remain there, presumably in their vast chamber with thousands of dormant members of their species, waiting out human civilization. And whatever was emerging from below level 7 when the facility was abandoned remains an unknown, sealed beneath hundreds of thousands of tons of concrete and collapsed rock, though seismic monitoring stations across northern New Mexico occasionally detect vibrations from that location, rhythmic patterns that occur every few months and which geologists attribute to settling of both geological structures, but which some researchers privately note seem too regular, too intentional, like something testing the strength of its containment, measuring whether the barrier that was erected in panic in 1980 will hold for decades or centuries or merely years before whatever the entities feared completes its interrupted awakening. The official record maintains that no facility ever existed beneath Archuleta Mesa, that the persistent rumors of an underground base near Dulce are the result of misidentified natural cave systems, conflated stories from unrelated military installations, and the tendency of isolated communities to generate folklore around government activities they don't fully understand. And yet anyone who examines satellite imagery of the area with sufficient resolution will notice subtle regularities in the terrain that suggest extensive subsurface modification, and locals in Dulce still report occasional tremors that seismologists can't adequately explain, and electronic equipment failures in specific locations that form a pattern around the mesa. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mackenzie died in 2019 at age 77, and among her personal effects, her family found detailed journals describing the March 1980 incident, journals that were immediately confiscated by military personnel who appeared within hours of her death, suggesting that someone had been monitoring her throughout her retirement to ensure that certain information remained contained. Dr. Patricia Vance lived until 2003 in a secure medical facility, and staff reported that until her final days, she would occasionally speak in that layered voice, translating messages that she claimed came from the entities, warnings that human deep drilling operations worldwide were approaching thresholds that would trigger responses from things that existed at depths where pressure and temperature should make life impossible, but where other rules apparently applied. Elder Joseph Whitehorse, before his death in 1983, told his grandson that the ant people had been merciful, that they had saved the excavation team when they could have simply allowed whatever was emerging from below to consume everyone present, and that the Apache owed them respect and should continue to honor the old agreements to leave certain places undisturbed. And his grandson, now a tribal elder himself, maintains these traditions and refuses all requests from mining companies and energy corporations to survey beneath Archuleta Mesa, citing cultural significance, but privately understanding that some boundaries exist for reasons that transcend property rights and touch on survival. The Dulce incident represents perhaps the clearest documented case of humanity encountering intelligence that predates our civilization, that operates on timescales that make our entire recorded history seem like a brief footnote, and that views our presence on the surface as temporary regardless of our own assumptions about permanence and progress. And the most disturbing aspect isn't that such intelligence exists, but rather that it's apparently not alone, and that the entities themselves feared something deeper, something older, something that even their vast patience and long-term planning couldn't safely accommodate. Seismic data from the Dulce area, when researchers can access uncensored versions, shows that the rhythmic vibrations detected from beneath the sealed facility have been slowly increasing in intensity and frequency since 1980, occurring every few months in the early years, but now detected every few weeks, suggesting that whatever was waking up when the facility was abandoned is continuing its emergence despite the containment efforts. And geological models indicate that the concrete plug sealing levels 6 and 7, while impressive by human engineering standards, represents barely an inconvenience to something operating at the scales of force that deep geological processes command. The broader implication that keeps certain people awake at night is simple. If there are entities living beneath New Mexico that have existed there for 15,000 years, and if there are things deeper still that even those entities fear, then what else exists beneath the surface of a planet that humans have occupied for mere thousands of years and have only explored to depths of a few miles at most? And what will humanity encounter as mining operations go deeper, as geothermal drilling reaches further into the Earth's crust, as the endless human hunger for resources pushes excavation into territories that older and wiser species learned long ago to avoid? The Dulce facility remains sealed. The area remains restricted, though the justifications have changed over the decades. And somewhere beneath Arculita Missa, in chambers that were ancient when human civilization began, something waits, and something deeper still slowly awakens. And the concrete and collapsed rock that separate them from the surface world grow thinner with each passing year, measured not in human time, but in the patient, inexorable rhythms of geological process that care nothing for the brief concerns of surface-dwelling species, who build their cities and fight their wars, never knowing that beneath their feet, other forms of existence pursue their own incomprehensible purposes on timescales that will outlast everything humanity has ever built or ever will build. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.